Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Horizons Insight series on signals. Today's Insight session is one in a series based on the Horizons Institute headline theme, which you can see from the screen is signals detecting, predicting, and responding to uncertainty. My colleague who's also on the call, Kate, and I talked to a number of people around the university looking for some research areas that perhaps fall outside the traditional boundaries of schools, centres and institutes, and looking for something that was really, really cross-campus. And if you want to know more about how we came to this idea, we can put in the chat the recording of last month's Signals Insight series, where Kate goes into some detail about how we got to this point. I should say that two of the people that we talked to about our potential theme are today's speakers, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But just to say, if you would like to know a little bit more about what Horizons is planning to do over the coming 9 to 12 months on the theme of signals, you can, you can come to, we've got one of two sessions coming up in September. On the 22nd of September, we've got a drop-in session for anybody who'd like to come, University House 12 till 4. If you're unable to make anything in person, we'd love to see you in person, but if you can't, then there'll be a webinar from on the 29th of September from 11:30 to 12:30. We'll be sending details round on this. And if you come to either of those, you will learn more about the quite busy program of work that we've got planned across the university, some opportunities for slightly longer intense programs to join. There are some opportunities for pump priming, but you'll hear all about it if you come to one of those sessions, and we will of course record the webinar for those who are unable to attend. Okay, so I don't think there's anything more I need to say on that. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Oh, did somebody? No, okay. We'll introduce our two speakers, and then I'm going to stop sharing, and I don't think either of them have slides, so it's going to be much more of a discursive conversation. So first of all, we have Professor Ed Manley, who is Professor of Urban Analytics in the School of Geography, covering urban data science and spatial cognition, amongst other things. And Ed is also Pro-Dean for Research and Innovation for the Faculty of Environment, which is why Kate and I targeted him as one of our people to chat to about how we might take this forward. And then after Ed, we'll have Professor Jack Holland, who is Professor of Global Security Challenges, International Relations, US-UK, and is also Pro-Dean for Research and Innovation for the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'm going to ask you to, if you can, save your questions to the end, and we'll keep an eye on the chat to see what's popping up. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing and invite Ed to
start talking.
Talk to us about his research.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And if everyone can stay muted, that would be grand for now. Thank you. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Samantha. So I've got just a few thoughts on my research area and how it relates to the theme. So a bit of background. I'm in the School of Geography. My work is around an area that's sort of changed in name, but used to be called urban analytics. Maybe it's more like urban science now, but it's really about the study of cities through primarily quantitative methods. And what I try to do is understand cities, urban systems, and the people at the heart of them, and how people come together to reproduce dynamics that we see every day. So they may be the the flows of traffic, it might be the people you bumped into on the street, it might be where you shop and where, how economies are created and recreated every single day. And so what we're interested in is really this, the people at the heart of cities and how they reproduce these dynamics. And the way we work is through a lot of data. The last 15 years, I've been very fortunate to be in the sort of involved in the area where there's been a big growth of availability of data at large scale about cities, geographies, and society in general. And so a lot of my work's been about making use of that data to understand these cities and these urban systems. And then the other aspect is about prediction, about future cities, about how we might develop models to understand how things might change in the future. And so, so it's a lot of my work's from this for understanding individual behavior and how it relates to these larger urban systems. So there's a few areas in which I see this overlapping with the theme. First of all, when we think about cities, oftentimes they can be thought of as kind of chaotic, complex systems. They're typically framed as where you walk out on the street, lots of people are moving around. It's really, you don't know what's going on. You have the sort of typical cliche view of what a city system or dynamic city might be like. But actually, there's a great deal of regularity to cities. Every day we see patterns reproduced as a product of social practice, working with the fact that we have work times when we do, where people are located, where workplaces are located, how transport systems were designed, how cities were designed, how different populations are distributed in different locations. So you have this kind of residual and quite robust structural facts that are reproducing these dynamics every day as a virtue of this distribution of people, activities, locations, and so forth. And so what you see every day are these kind of regularities, irregular peaks in activity. If you think about transport, you see a regular peak in the morning of people moving to work and regularly in the evening when they're moving back from work. And then you have some variation across places, but to some degree, there is a lack of uncertainty at that top level about how a city system, or maybe a large geographic system evolves over time during the course of a day. But you do get quite a lot, and this is where I come in from a geography perspective, variation at more granular scales over space and over time. So you can start to see that some locations have particular characteristics. So some locations are more irregular than the larger system. When I've looked at the data, and usually I would show a slide to sort of this effect, but you can one of the work we did in the past was working with Oyster card data, as it used to be called, in London's transport system. And you could look at different stations. So the whole system reproduces this sort of regularities. But actually, you look at individual stations, you see very different things. There's regularity at those individual locations, but you see the diversity across locations. And this comes down to sort of some of the more theoretical aspects about what is reproduced by the city and by people moving through the city and this kind of character. And there's an urban theorist in the 60s called Jane Jacobs, and she was around New York as it went through various stages of urban development. But one of the things she was sort of observing were this principle, or this idea of vitality, or it sort of could be akin to vibrancy. And I think we know it as people who live in cities or been to cities, that you know that some locations are particularly vibrant, feel particularly exciting, and they are generally a mix of presence of people, but also the presence of particular land uses, building designs, densities that bring together people. But these are locations where it's not continuous. They are irregular in their character as well. You don't know what's going to happen. It could be quiet one moment, could be busy the next. So while regularity is sort of an interesting component to cities, it's the irregularity that is sort of more interesting and more exciting, I think. for somebody studying cities. And so a lot of my work has actually moved on to irregularity, looking at disruptions, short-term disruptions, how people change their behavior when there is a change to the normal system. Where do they go? What do they do? COVID was a goldmine for lots of people's research. But that was one area, like, what do people do now that all these systems have been stop, all the kind of structural components have changed, and how do we reproduce some of these dynamics? But also interested in the longer term change as well. So how do these changes occur? How does cultural change or people's changes in their perspectives, worldviews, preferences, how do they lead to longer term changes in what we see in the city? So these systems, urban systems, are about regularities, about irregularities. And so what we're trying to do in my area is try to use data. So in this way, the sort of signals aspect comes in. How do we use data that's derived from lots of different sources to understand these systems? So there's two sort of areas of this for my work. Obviously from geography more broadly, there's loads of data, always has been, about collected from censuses and sort of traditional data sources, surveys and so forth. But the last 15 years have seen this growth in secondary data sources. So these are where data are collected for a primary purpose, then repurposed for understanding other systems. So they would be things like mobile phone transactions or mobile phone movement records. GPS trajectories might be collected by logistics companies or and so forth. But we're talking here like millions of records of data and movements that allow us to sort of dig into some of these sort of flows and these dynamics. There is, but with these data, there's a complete lack of context generally. We don't know who the people are. We know very little about them. We are usually, we're working away, we're never identifying anyone who do that, but it's sort of, you only get to a certain level of detail. So you can only understand to some high level, essentially. And so one thing I've been moving towards is then moving into sort of smaller scale data sets and understanding then this link between these larger flows and then actually the people at the heart of them. And I mentioned my work on spatial cognition, but this is really about how do people respond when they're in different locations. When you are in an area of high vibrancy, does it stimulate you? Does it produce stress? Does it what are your responses? And we can start to collect data here on for bio responses. So things like eye tracking or which can happen in place in situ in cities, galvanic skin responses, sweat responses, mobile EEG, which is your brain responses. So all of these things are kind of adding a new layer of detail about people's relationship with these locations and these situations in cities. But yeah, so turning to uncertainty, uncertainty in all of this sort of quest to understand is something we do think about, although probably not enough. So we have obviously we have all these data. I kind of mentioned these large scale secondary data sets. They're used in a sort of unfettered way to tell us, academically speaking, like what's happening in the world, but without really digging into some of the issues with accuracy. So for example, mobile phone data is something that's used at a sort of aggregate level to understand, let's say, these dynamics, but there's very little detail on the error or that is associated with the data, or very little detail about how the data are collected on the devices. As I said, very little detail about who are the people who are holding the phone, how many there's so many questions that are kind of inherent to these data and that are either not captured or essentially ignored, that it is a kind of strange elephant in the room that we don't really kind of get into it. And I suppose, yeah, what am I going to say? Yeah, I mean, there's loads of sort of biases as well at the heart of these data as well, like in terms of who, if you're talking about mobile phone data, older people may be less inclined to carry their phone around with them. Maybe that's less common now, or some people may be more willing to download an app that sends off the GPS traces to some random company. These are got introducing biases that we don't understand. Card transactions data is another one where you get sort of some people more likely to use that than others. So in all of these data sets, and we can kind of talk about them as a kind of almost like a panacea for how we understand the world, there's all this inherent uncertainty. And all of this kind of comes back to also how we can conduct these analyses. A lot of the time when we're thinking about these systems, we're trying to explain what the people at the heart of them are doing or thinking. And a lot of our analysis doesn't really even consider that, like consider the people in a much detail. So for example, what my ERC project I'm just starting up is really looking at whether the whole basis for analysis, which essentially operates on a Euclidean plane, has makes assumptions about Euclidean distances. Like because I'm near something, it means it's going to affect me more, or I'm going to be more likely to go to it. Actually, there's a lot more individuality perception about this engagement, personal engagement in the space, and how do we link that into our understanding of these larger systems? If we can understand these people and how they relate to space, how can we better understand their role in these larger urban systems? So there's a lot of uncertainty about that, but a lot of uncertainty in general. And then the other side about uncertainty is about how we predict the future. So I've talked a lot about basically using data to understand now. The other half of what we do is about predicting the future. One project I work on called Infuse is looking at how do we get to future scenarios where we have reduced car ownership, essentially by people not needing to own cars, right? By introducing alternative modes that allow them to live their life without owning their own car. But to get there in the speed we need to get there to address the issues with climate change, we need much faster phase transitions, much faster change. And it really, there is a lot of uncertainty about how those changes might come about. What are the levers we need to pull? How do sentiments or perspectives need to change to get us there? There's so many different paths. And what we can do with agent-based modeling, which is the kind of technique I use, we can start to map out those paths. We can say, okay, well, a little bit of this here and a little bit of that here, and this will allow us to get to this endpoint, or and essentially we want to get there without we want to disrupt sort of the current sets of regularities to achieve these big changes, ideally without causing a revolution. But these are the kind of challenges we're grappling with. So essentially I'm sort of wanted to sort of raise this sort of this area of challenge around cities, around their inherent irregularity, and the sort of uncertainty is associated also with the data and the modeling that we use to understand them. So and look at that, I actually hit 15 minutes. Unbelievable.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I've already got questions, but anyway, we'll save those as well. You mentioned the word revolution. You don't want to start a revolution. That's kind of understandable. But on that note, I might hand over to Jack to see what he may think about the future.
Thank you. Oh, you've restarted my timer as well. That's useful. I can properly pretend I'm Jack Bauer. All right, I'll cover my face up so that doesn't distract me. The plan is to give you a bit of a pub level rant with a bit of academic stuff in there. You can pretend you've had 2 pints of IPA and ask some questions about Donald Trump at the end. So to start with, signals. I work in politics and international relations. One of the first associations of signals in IR is with the British Army. And that's certainly true for me. The best man at my wedding was an old school friend who's now a major in the army and works in the Royal Corps of Signals. They like to think of themselves as some of the first ones over the top and into the battlefield. Their vibe is a bit different from that. The vibe is more sorting out the bag of wires that you've kept for 20 years to work out, which one's a SCART lead and what goes into the back of the DVD player. It's a bit more IT and cyber and nerdy than first ones over the top, but their role is essentially to get the comms working on the battlefield. I'm going to duck talking about the specifics of that and go to a slightly higher level in international relations, the level of foreign policy signaling. So I will get to flickering, don't worry, but to start with, foreign policy signaling is really important. It's important because if you get it wrong, it leads to conflict. If you get it right, it can lead to de-escalation and avoid warfare. We have published in the journal that I edit, the British Journal of Politics and International Relations, a special issue on foreign policy signaling in the Indo-Pacific, which has got a really nice introduction that sets out in quite accessible terms what is signaling, what isn't signaling, and some of the main kind of classificatory breakdowns of variations of signaling. The biggest ones that states will deploy: sunk costs, so things like troop deployments, pretty big sunk cost. If you stick troops somewhere, you're signaling something that is expensive. It's going to be important to you in one direction or another. It could be something like hosting the World Cup. Lots of signaling going on at the moment with various forms of power. And I always think of when Qatar hosted the World Cup and stuck Messi in the traditional gown. There's some pretty explicit foreign policy signaling going on there for Qatar and what Qatar wants to be and how it wants to represent itself. Second form of signaling, different from sunk costs, is reputational costs. So you can tie hands. You can commit yourself to courses of action that if you then deviate away from them, is going to have some sort of reputational impact on you. And those promises, those assertions, the rhetoric, the language can come in different forms. The kind of biggest forms tends to be treaties and more institutional level commitments. At the very thinnest end, where it starts to kind of fade away, is the more rhetorical platitudes towards things. And trying to distinguish those things is vitally important. Classic case studies on this in the IR literature are things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the attempt to interpret different signals on both sides. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of philosophy of social science to get back to flickering. I'm going to go through discourse and into questions of meaning, and we will end up with Trump back in the pub, don't worry. So to start with on discourse, my research tends to look effectively at foreign policy signaling, but I wouldn't use the word signaling very frequently. There's a kind of bracketed literature on that in IR. I talk more generally about the use of language, but discourse is broader than that. Discourse includes actions. So it's statements and speeches on the one hand. We might be looking at things like Obama's pivot to Asia. That's a pretty clear signaling of the intent of US foreign policy in that moment. I began with a PhD that looked at the war on terror, and phrases like global war on terror were inventions at the time that did important things. And unfortunately now I'm trying to interpret phrases like fire and fury, and what does fire and fury actually mean in foreign policy signaling. Other nice ones are things like the US has relabeled the Pacific as the Indo-Pacific, and that is a foreign policy signal done strategically towards India to try to do certain things to the balance of power in the region. But it's also the actions and images, as well as the words, the language, and the speeches that make these things up. So if you send your aircraft carrier through the Indo-Pacific, or if you send something close in the South China Sea, you are performing foreign policy signaling through the costs that you've taken to actually do that. One of my favorite examples of this is when Hillary Clinton hands over a reset button to Lavrov, and it says reset in English to reset the nuclear relationship between the two states, but they'd actually spelt it wrong in Russian, and it meant overload, not the foreign policy signal that Hillary Clinton meant to send, but a clear example of using something very material and very visual to send a clear foreign policy message. You can think of Keir Starmer handing over letters to Trump from the King. Very good foreign policy signaling. You can also think of body language. So when I used to work on Bush and Blair, very different forms of masculinity. Bush would walk in literally swinging his arms like he's the most powerful ape in the room. Very clear assertions of certain forms of masculinity. And you can even think of Donald Trump's MAGA hats, right? This is visual synecdoche. It's the part that stands for the whole. All you need to see is the red baseball cap to hear Donald Trump's entire narrative of Make America Great Again from a past that has now been taken away by corrupted elites who've betrayed the people, and only one man has the power to bring that back in the form of a glorious future. And you can read all of that just from the red hat. And I have in my office, I have to look at my own face again to make sure it's on screen now, the old hat. So this is before MAGA hats were invented. This is from 2016, and it's Donald Trump for president. And it looks weird because it's pink and it has more words on it than you expect. You expect it to be a MAGA hat right now. The visual synecdoche of those MAGA hats is incredible. It tells an entire political narrative just from the symbolism of a red hat. And yes, I am planning to write a paper on that at some point. You could also do something with elongated red ties, but I need to move on for the time. So I said philosophy of social science. Problem with signals, problem with a discursive approach, the question of truth, meaning, and interpretation. So the interpretation of signals. If you've got someone like Bush Sr., Bush Sr. was very good at saying something in public that needed to be said for a certain audience and doing something very different through the diplomatic back channels. So he would very publicly, for example, censure Beijing for human rights abuses, and very, very clearly to the Chinese signal through the back channels, don't worry, I prioritize trade over human rights. We are realists, we are sensible, we are pragmatic. I have to say these things in public, but in private, we're going to continue to work with you and prioritize mutual prosperity. In IR theory, there's a debate between two strands of realism. Do you interpret arms buildups as offensive maneuvers or defensive maneuvers? If you are acquiring military capacity, relative material capability, do you have to read that thing as a potential threat to your state, or as someone else just kind of being a hedgehog and rolling up in a ball and trying to look after themselves? And there's no consensus on that. And that debate structures a lot of the theoretical steps that follow through an IR as to what states should do and how you actually create the conditions for peace and the avoidance of war. Classic academic move. I'm a constructivist. I think they're both wrong, and it depends, which, you know, academics say that about everything, right? Everybody else is wrong, and context matters. For me, it's cultural, contextual. To understand foreign policy signaling, you have to understand the history of the state, the discourses that comprise its strategic culture and its political culture. You have to understand the national identity of the state and the specific nuances of those in charge at the time. And without those layers of things from the kind of longue durée of a historical narrative through the politics of the moment to the specificities of that individual political figure, I don't think you can make sense of foreign policy signaling in lieu of all of those things, which makes it much more complex, much more messy, and much more nuanced. And it brings in the history, sociology, the psychology, and all of those interdisciplinary things that you need to make sense of a situated actor in a given strategic context. So a good example of this is Russian troop buildup on the borders of Ukraine before the most recent intervention. Massive disagreement across US and UK intelligence communities as to what that foreign policy signaling meant. I spoke to good friends in the MOD who confidently told me that this was a form of signaling to leverage gains and influence, but was not real. It wasn't imminent intervention, and they were wrong. At the very top levels of US and UK intelligence, they got this right. They knew what was going on, but a huge swathe of MOD and in the US DOD that actually hadn't predicted the intervention that was about to follow. I have a PhD student here at Leeds who's working on this conflict, and she's argued that the kind of critical theory, the contextual cultural side of IR was much better at understanding what was to come because they understand Putin's position in long-standing narratives of Russian history that have a particular partial, very contingent reading of US history based on a form of ontological security. That's an understanding of the self with an autobiographical narrative that's continuous and not disrupted. And understanding those things in Russian foreign policy would lead to the inevitable conclusion that intervention was going to happen. It was part of that narrative story of Putin's reassertion of a particular autobiographical Russian self, which was completely different from those who were looking at the expansion of NATO and those kinds of more material arguments about Russian encirclement and a feeling of threat and inferiority in great power politics. So there's a real big divide in IR, and I've got a PhD student who's on the kind of constructivist side of this argument. It's basically narrative rather than a big game of geopolitical chess. So I promised you Trump and a rant. If you take nothing else away from this, imagine how difficult it is to intellectualize the current moment and put those intellectual templates over what's going on in US foreign policy. So some have taken approaches like madman theory. So is Trump strategically all over the place wildly as part of the art of the deal and an attempt to exact the greatest gains from a transactional realism in which he performs insanity? Maybe. Some have argued there's just low conceptual clarity in foreign policy at the moment. Maybe. I've taken a slightly different route in my own research, but this is not easy to do with Trump because it is inconsistent foreign policy. And I've argued that to understand Trump, you need 3 levels. You need US history, the domestic context of the moment, so one of affective polarization. Everything Trump does, including in foreign policy, is through the lens of a domestic political battle in which his enemies or his opponents are enemies in an existential sense. He's locked in that sort of Schmittian battle where it's a relative game and only one man is going to be left standing at the end of it. So foreign policy against Iran becomes an attempt to vanquish Obama, and everything is read through that lens still. And the third is you have to understand Trump himself, because there are Trump-isms that you can't make sense of what's going on without. So Trump, easily led by the last person he's spoken to. So if you want to get your influence on US foreign policy, be the last person to leave the room. Ideally have big slides with big pictures on. Ideally, those slides would have pictures of animals and children on, because he's more amenable to those kinds of images than others. So I'm thinking in particular around Syria and accusations of, well, validated accusations of chemical warfare and things. And the thing that got Trump's attention there was images of animals that had suffered. And that was really what kind of changes his views on Assad. So he's an interesting individual at that level. I've tended to look in Trump 1, so 2016, at the role of American history and Trump's location within it. So Trump is a broadly Jacksonian president. He's a military populist who believes that the US national interest is much more narrowly defined geographically than most US presidents have thought previously. So more Wilsonian and Hamiltonian themes see US interests as being a long way away from the US borders. Trump has tended to bring that much closer to home. He doesn't care about what's going on in most of the world unless it affects American physical and economic well-being. And with that foreign policy stance, he's much closer to the average American. Most Americans are much closer to that. We just haven't seen it so much in the White House because presidents tend to be more globalist and more plugged into those ideas of internationalism. So he's not a complete outlier. He's not completely arbitrary. There is an American tradition of doing these things, and yet he brings his particular Trumpian flourish to this that does make it look a little bit different. For the last minute, I'm going to tee you up with your pub level questions on flickering. So the paper I'm writing at the moment with some good co-authors at LSE and Queen Mary on, is Trump 2.0, this Trump, different from Trump 1? Are we seeing flickering where there's actual system change off the back of this guy? And is that system change not just democratic backsliding, but the erosion of democratic norms to the point where we're actually seeing fascism? And that fascism question is the one we're wrestling with. What are the criteria that we would identify fascism with? And I've brought a German in to help me do this properly. He's excellent at this stuff. And is there a system change at the level of the international, away from a preservation of liberal international order towards the re-emergence of multipolarity, great power politics, as we've seen with claims of spheres of influence and the Dunroe Doctrine claims that threaten things like NATO with the geographic claims on Greenland and all the rest of it. So I will leave you with that pub level provocation of, is this the end of the global system that we've enjoyed for so long? Or has it got enough kind of bounce back ability, to use a football term, to actually survive Trump in 2.0? I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. I'm just going to give it a minute whilst people perhaps, I'm just going to check that we haven't got any questions in the chat. Think about questions that you might have for Ed and Jack. And if you do have a question, it would be nice if you felt able to turn your camera on and ask the question yourself. So I'm not seeing any hands up at the moment. Oh, yes, sorry. Rodanti and then Chris. Welcome. Rodanti?
Can you see me now? No.
I can see your back. Don't worry if it's a problem.
Now you can see
yes,
me.
yes.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, both. They are very interesting presentations. I just want to ask Jack something, which has to do with La Longue Durée, or maybe not La Longue Durée, but the level of events. If we start thinking comparatively about presidencies and go back to Obama's kind of stylization and his kind of performative self-presentation, which was crafted very carefully. I mean, he studied how to perform in public, reportedly so. And compare this with what Trump is doing currently. It's very rough, it's very unplanned, and so on and so forth. Can we use this to study this shift in what is going on from the self-presentation in public, which is very American middle class, to what Trump does, which is not just rough, but also rude, and full of isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., etc.
Should I come straight back in on that, or do you want to take more questions to start with?
No, I think, well, you come in on that, Jack. Thank you, because I don't know where the others might be headed.
It's a great question. So can we study the change in foreign policy through the change in the performativity of American political leaders? Yes, we can. So the working hypothesis for the new paper on fascism is that it's not quite fascism yet. It's a form of proto-fascism, but part of that is the reveling in performative violence and that kind of embracing of American power at the broadest level. Is become infatuated with actually that reach of US military might as Deus Ex Machina to go into Venezuela and do what it did in Venezuela, which is on a military level incredibly impressive. It's also completely horrifying that that capability exists and the way it's been done. And on a lower level, it's things like being in campaign rallies where there's a celebration of violence against journalists, or there's the embracing of the use of ICE to murder US citizens in particular states. And that embracing of that violence in a very, very performative sense at the individual level of Donald Trump, I do think says something about American policy and foreign policy much more broadly. And you're right. I mean, Obama was a study in performativity of American middle classness, so as not to spook a potential electorate. He knew he had to perform in particular ways because he was who he was and what he represented for American progress. And he learned that the less you say, the more that you can project what you want onto him, and he can be the hope and the change that you want, whatever form that takes. So Obama was incredibly considered and careful and all the rest of it to political gain. And yeah, completely different from Trump. I'll stop there because there's loads more questions.
Thanks, Jack. Heading over to Chris now. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Samantha. Yeah, thanks, Jack. And it's really, really interesting. I'm going to lower the tone a little bit, if that's okay, because I want to ask about another political performer, and that's Count Binface, who is going to be standing in the Clacton by-election. It strikes me that we have these challenges on the right with performative cruelty and and the rise of proto-fascism, and there's a discussion there that seems to dominate the media. But what about the rise on the left of these sort of left-wing comedic parties? It's been, so Zelensky was a comedian, and the Icelandic, I think the Pirate Party in Iceland were a big political movement. Is there chaos in both ends, and why do we focus more on the right? And then I guess also, just to follow on, what happens next? Are we going to continue right, or is there going to be a correction after the potential flickering?
Okay, I'll do my best. I mean, I would point you to a literature on this rather than sort of tackle it myself. So James Brassett at Warwick University is absolutely excellent on the role of comedy in politics, and has got a great book on what humour can do. There's a bit of a growth literature in international relations and foreign policy on the role of humour, including use of social media memes in Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. I've just declined a mate from New Zealand who sent me a message on WhatsApp saying, do you want to do a paper on memes in the World Cup? I'm so busy, I can't do it, but it would be a great fun paper to do. So this is kind of a real thing. There is a literature on this at the moment. I mean, I'm fascinated by bin face. So Rachel Reeves' comment on this was, I'm not going to tell Farage what to do, but if he wanted to spend the summer arguing with a bin, that's on him, right? And it's very, very well done. I guess there's an obsession with the right because of its implications, but also because of the biases within universities in the UK. It tends to be a focus, I think, with less critical reflection on the same things on the other side. Zelensky's fascinating. I mean, we talk about politics as performance. This is someone who was playing president in a show, on a comedy show, who's then become one of the great military leaders of our era. I have a book on my shelf, Fictional Television in American Politics. So I've looked at the role of the small screen, including comedy shows like Veep and things like that, arguing for a long time before Donald Trump was a thing that this matters, that there's not a hard line between politics and popular culture. Politics continues throughout popular culture, including our comedy shows. That was a much harder sell before Trump and The Apprentice. People get it a lot more now. And I was a bit sad that they whacked Trump's face on the front of that book, because it became all about Trump. He sucks the oxygen out of every room. So I'm completely on board with that this matters. I agree with you that we focus more on the right than the left. And I'm going to duck the provocation of what's next and where do we go, because I got no idea. Yeah, so it makes it exciting and it's up for grabs, but I don't know.
Okay, thanks, Jack. In the interest of time, I'm going to whiz on to Poppy.
Hi, I don't know how this question's going to come out. It's a sort of merging of several things. One of the things I was particularly interested that you said, Jack, was about understanding someone and understanding the state that they are from. And I would like to take that back a bit further and say, try and understand someone maybe from the city that they spent a lot of time in, because New York is not on the far right of American politics. And I'm just wondering if between you and Ed, there's any commentary there on, whether New York has had a moderating effect on Trump at all. Or because he seems to revel in his Miami, Florida-ness. So I'm just wondering if there is anything where we can actually understand something more about where they've lived in a country, particularly given, for example, New York is the size or is larger than some small countries.
Do you want me to go first, Ed, and then yeah? So absolutely. I mean, Trump contextually is less important. He's from New York. It's more important his background in real estate and how he's approached business in a sort of Sopranos type way with a mafia-like language of ratting and loyalty and all the rest of it. That says, I think, more about his personality than New York writ large. For people like George W. Bush Jr., it mattered a lot. The Texan roots were really important. That folksy charm and his propensity to mangle his words was really important. He was seen to be a man of the people through those things, and he played it up. He was genuinely like that. So we would go on a holiday in Clear Brush in Texas, right? It's not a lazy guy. Like, he would choose quite hard things to do. He's not playing golf all the time like Trump is. On the geography of it, you've got different traditions of American foreign policy, and the Jacksonian tradition that Trump is closest to, or was closest to before he got completely distracted by Iran and arguably has failed on his own terms. This Jacksonian tradition comes out of Appalachia. It's from the Ulster Scots. The diaspora have moved into Appalachia. So West Virginia and the white working class kind of coal mining communities being the quintessence of a Jacksonian tradition. That's the main geography of the tradition. And no, Trump is not from that, but he is smart enough to know how to exploit it. And he does habitually and instinctively hold some of those values of he doesn't care about what's happening for human rights causes in other parts of the world, right? So it's partly mined for strategic impact, and partly that is what he thinks.
So yeah, so on the city side, I mean, I don't, obviously Jack's the Trump guy, but I mean, it's interesting that Trump grew up came of age, I suppose, in New York during the time of Central Park 5 and a lot of those sort of that hysterical reactions to crime. He was part of that whole discussion. I mean, for me, there is one thing we've done in my work is look at the effect of where you grew up on how you navigate through a city. So this is a very different context, obviously, but we did show that there is a relationship between the design of the city streets, so whether it's a gridded city like New York or a complicated organic structure like mixed structure like London, that has an effect on your future ability to navigate. So there's clearly a relationship between the environment you're growing up in and your brain development. And I do think this is something that's reproduced as well in terms of your daily interactions, your daily interaction with people on the metro, or or the people you see and spend time with. I think that will have an effect. I would imagine that if Trump is swanning around in big cars from when he was a teenager and driving past people who aren't like him, he may take a certain view. Whereas someone who is actually on the metro and interacting with people on a daily basis may take a different view. That's just a sort of speculation. It's quite hard to get that kind of data.
Interesting, though. Thank you. I'm going to go to the other questioners. If possible, I know it's tempting. Can we ask quite broad questions? I mean, I don't know if I could talk about Trump all day. I'd probably have to go and lie in a darkened room. But anyway, moving on. Edward, welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Ted Newman. I'm with the School of Politics and International Studies. I'm also one of the co-directors for the Center for Global Security Challenges. So this has been really fascinating. Thanks, Jack and Ed. I mean, I see quite a lot of analytical value applying this concept of flickering in my field, which is global security and conflict, including civil war. And so obviously has something to say about understanding early warning signals and how unstable or oscillating social systems can be an indicator of coming crisis or breakdown, including civil wars. So, for example, one of my interests in civil war, we understand quite a lot about conflict drivers, and these exist in many, many societies in the world, but thankfully only a limited number of societies actually experience large-scale violent conflict. So an enormous amount of analysis is committed to, understanding how the combination of conflict drivers produces violent conflict. And so, yeah, I think flickering in that sense is really interesting. So it has something to say about resilience then as well. But the way that I think flickering suggests that systems don't necessarily deteriorate in a smooth linear way, that you can have temporary recovery even as resilience is becoming eroded, I think is perhaps something that could bring added value. And I think it also fits with this idea of the polycrisis. I was listening to Ed use the expression system and systems thinking a lot in the urban context, something I've been thinking about globally, the polycrisis, how different challenges overlap, compound, reinforce each other. I think it's really fascinating there, and hopefully as a centre we're going to put some ideas together within this Horizons headline theme. But I do have a question more specifically for Ed, and that's about the methods that you use to assess patterns and trends in behaviour that may suggest disruption in urban life, and perhaps the threat of breakdown or even conflict. I mean, agent-based modelling, I think, is, as you said, really interesting. But I was wondering if there are any specific statistical models or methods that you use to capture the non-linear dynamics of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. That's really interesting. I think so in terms of understanding, there's a couple of ways we're looking at disruption. I mean, what one thing we are doing is using data on disrupted systems to look at how people have changed their behavior as a response. So they will be more empirical analyses, but then probably, and we're moving towards this, using sort of either decision models, so logistic regression type models, or machine learning models to predict the responses, or to reproduce those responses. The idea would be then to embed those within agent-based models. So I think for me, that's when you're talking. I'm glad you came to ABM, because I think they are, to me, it goes back to this idea that these social systems are reproduced, or can be reproduced, on a sort of under a certain set of assumptions, and sort of we establish an equilibrium essentially within a social system, but then that can very quickly break down from very local deviations from that equilibrium. And I think, I'm not sure we've got to a point with our work anyway where we've connected the data to a behavior, to a prediction for a mass change in the system. I think and it's interesting, the conflict scenario, we are trying to get there with this sort of, for the sort of vehicle, the car ownership problem. It requires a phase transition. It requires a mass transition, and it won't be technological only. It will be social to some extent. But yeah, I think it's a big problem, and I don't have a very simple answer. I suppose it's the answer.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. Okay, we've got 3 more questions, so I'm going to whiz through. Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha, and thanks for 2 really interesting talks. I've got 2 comments really, then a broad question. So the first comment is about misreading signals. So think about the US-Iran conflict at the moment, where both sides are clearly misreading the signals that each side is sending. Is that deliberate? Are they deliberately misreading signals for political ends and kind of conflict continuation purposes? Second question is about second comment rather is about the fascism issue and Trump, and the risk that we don't see what's new if we constantly go back to the model of 1930s fascism. But my broad questions about the irregularity thing that Ed brought up earlier, and it applies to both of you, I think. At what point does irregularity become the new regularity? And I think that links back to Ted's question previously. So what's the tipping point between irregularity and new regularity? So that's my broad question.
Thanks, Stuart. Ed, can I go to you first? And if I might ask you to keep your answers brief, only because I know there's two people patiently waiting.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I was hoping you were going to go to Jack first. I was going to say, I'd say I might dodge it by saying it's a question of scale. I mean, every day is irregular in some way. So what sort of regularity are we dealing with? To me, I don't know. To me, like a lot of the urban systems I study have been similar for a long time. I mean, they've been that the sort of reproducing of these dynamics has been similar for quite a long period. I suppose there's some sort of reassurance in that. We've returned from a pandemic to a regular system of some sort. So maybe, I don't know. Sorry, I haven't got a very good answer to that one. Maybe Jack will give you something more.
I'm just going to rant more about Trump, as is my usual role at work. I can't answer it from the Iranian perspective because I'm not an Iran expert. From the US side, has Trump misread things? Yes. So Iran is a real pain intellectually because it makes Trump's foreign policy fail on its own terms. It doesn't fit in with a Jacksonian foreign policy. And he's become distracted. He's become infatuated with US power and what's possible. You can think back to, he loved the mother of all bombs, right? Dropping the largest bomb the US has ever dropped apart from the nukes. He loves that kind of thing. Venezuela's blown his mind and he's become obsessed with the possibilities of what US reach can do. And he's also become very, very close to Israel as well. And Israel's had an important role in dragging the US into this particular war. So it's failed on its own terms. He has misread things. As I said at the start, he reads Iran through the lens of the polarized nature of US domestic politics. So he reads Iran through what did Obama do? What did Biden do? And how can I pose that and paint them as fundamentally wrong to vanquish their political legacy? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Thank you, Jack. Sorry, I'm rushing people. Katie, welcome.
Thank you. I think so. Following the theme of the difference between signals and system change and disruption and irregularities and system change, it's really hard to link that, as you've both said, but it seems to be a really important point to understand how to actually steer system change. So is there any way that we can identify how signals are possibilities for steering change, or how is there a way we sort of think about linking that? Would you go that way? Because we can't just let systems change passively, given the complex nature and the contestation. But what can we do actively to use signals?
Yeah. I mean, signals taken in. It depends what you suppose you mean by signals. I mean, evidence is evidence models signal? Are they signals? Is that? I mean, one thing we're trying to do is say sort of through this Infuse project is actually engage citizens and policymakers in the evidence and try to better make use of what we have to design policy or shape people's perspectives on policy. It's really difficult though. Actually, you can produce these very accurate models, but actually require someone like Trump or someone at a lower rank perhaps to make a decision that is based on the evidence. And I think that's a very tricky part to it. And I think when you start talking about uncertainty, it's very hard to communicate that as a concept in any way. You know, it's sort of to say that this is our prediction, but it may vary this much depending on these assumptions. It's just really difficult to get people to really focus on it. So I've lost a bit of faith, I suppose, but yeah.
Thank you. Jack, quick answer before I move on to the last question. I know we're at time, so.
It's fine. I don't have a good one, so move on.
Okay. AJ, last but not least, welcome. Quick question.
So the theme of my questions, unfortunately for both Ed and Jack, is on time. I work on decision making under deep uncertainty. And so to Ed, specifically, sort of disruption and effects over time is very interesting for me. Some disruptions are sharp, like COVID, and they have very sharp effects, but they also have lingering effects compared to something like climate change that is also a longer period of time. So at the urban scale, how easy or difficult is it to disentangle the effects of different types of different disruptions on the system change? And just to complete my question, for Jack, I like the example of the flickering of the flickering example for the democratic backsliding in the US towards fascism, and others have also made comparisons to the 1930s. I think the question I have is, during both eras, was there more of a slow evolution? Relatively slow evolution and clear direction of travel, punctuated by opposition to that democratic backsliding? Or was there more of an oscillation between the two states, if you may, as in flickering in that sense, so between a steady state democratic system and an autocratic fascist system?
Okay,
Okay.
super quickly. So I understand the effects on disruption long term. I think what we can do is start to do causal or pre-post analyses, so looking at what's happened before, how people have changed their behavior over time. But it's very hard to have the longitudinal data on people. You have to look at them in cross sections, and it's not brilliant. It's probably more I could say to that. I think the other aspect of we're quite interested in is the sort of changes in attitudes as well, and how that affects behavior. So over to Jack.
Did it oscillate more? I mean, the first thing says I'm not an expert on Germany in the 1930s, hence bringing in a mate who is. But the line from him at the moment on the US is that the US is not Germany in 1938, but it might be Germany in 1928. That's kind of where he sees it. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on between 1928 and 1939, right? So it's a contingent moment, but there's enough forewarnings there that we should take it seriously and see if the historical comparison is useful for shaping, to go back to kind of Katie's point, the kinds of interventions we might put in place to steer a different future. So maybe that's a positive take on, the question of is America fascist right now?
Great.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Sorry, AJ. Thank you both so much.